Thank you, Mr. President. Winter has arrived in Pittsburgh. Today, 11 3-foot-tall wooden Stars of David. They make up a sidewalk memorial in the city's Squirrel Hill neighborhood. And they'll be brought inside the Tree of Life Synagogue to protect this display of the city's grief from the snowstorm. Pittsburgh, the Jewish community, and our entire country were shaken by a horrific anti-Semitic attack that occurred on October 27th during Shabbat morning services. Members of 3 Jewish congregations were present: the Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light congregations. 11 innocent people were senselessly slaughtered in the attack. 6 others were wounded, including 4 police officers who responded to the attack. Even within this act of evil, there were displays of amazing courage and humanity. The first responders who rushed into danger to apprehend the shooter and protect others. The Jewish doctors and nurses who cared for not just the victims, but the shooter as well. Like Dr. Jeffrey Cohen, the president of Allegheny County Hospital, who's actually a member of the Tree of Life Synagogue. And he displayed an amazing and remarkable courage and humanity in visiting the shooter to ask him about his care and to try to make some sense of the attack. And after such an inexplicable event, all of us look for the motivation of the perpetrator and ask why. Well, let's be clear about what this shooting was about. It was a cowardly act of brutal violence fueled by anti-Semitism, a corrupt and repulsive ideology that really betrays our most fundamental values and distorts history. John Adams had an interesting quote. John Adams said, "If I was an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They've given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern," end quote. Well, despite Judaism's incredible contributions to mankind and to our own country and our country's founding, anti-Semitism is still far too prevalent. We can't ignore it. We must condemn it. We must challenge it. I think there's a lesson here from Dr. Cohen, whom I mentioned earlier. When asked how he could visit a patient with so much hatred, Dr. Cohen replied, and I quote, "I thought it was important to at least talk to him and meet him." Cohen explained, "You can't on the one hand say we should talk to each other, and then I don't talk to him." You know, I think Dr. Cohen's wisdom and insights and humanities could be useful for this body as well. I've spent a lot of time working with colleagues and others to try to find some common sense solutions to address some element of the gun violence that plagues this country. Too often, Mr. President, it seems to me we talk past each other rather than speaking with each other. Now, I know there are strongly held views on the Second Amendment, and I'm one of the senators who has strongly held views on the Second Amendment. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. But I'm also convinced there is common ground among people who have different views on the Second Amendment. In this session that we are wrapping up of this Congress, we overwhelmingly enacted legislation to improve NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which is used to prevent the sale of firearms to people who should not have firearms. Now, think about that. We all agree that firearms should not be sold to criminals and the dangerously mentally ill. I have never heard any colleague in this body suggest that firearms should be sold to violent criminals or dangerously mentally ill people. No, we all agree, as does our entire society, that these are people who shouldn't have firearms. And so we have a NICS system that is designed, when it works well, to identify people who should not be able to have firearms because they are convicted criminals or dangerously mentally ill or both. And we in this body recently passed legislation to improve the effectiveness of that NICS system. Well, since we all accept the premise of the NICS system, and we have in fact enacted legislation to improve the effectiveness of the NICS system, shouldn't we also agree to close the remaining loopholes in this background check, in this NICS system? So one measure that I think ought to be a consensus measure, and I know has bipartisan support, is that we should cover, using the NICS system, cover all commercial sales of firearms with a background check. This is just a common sense measure that is entirely consistent and compatible with the Second Amendment. The Constitution guarantees the right of law-abiding people to own firearms, but there is no such right for violent criminals and those who are dangerously mentally ill. I'm not the only one who believes that. None other than the very pro-Second Amendment Justice Antonin Scalia wrote that it is completely compatible with the Second Amendment to have regulations like a background check. Senator Joe Manchin and I have introduced bipartisan legislation that would address this loophole, that would expand background checks. It's pretty simple. It simply says that all commercial sales of firearms, including those sales at gun shows and over the internet, need to be subject to criminal and mental background checks. If you pass the background check, you get to buy your gun. But if you fail the background check, then you are exactly the kind of person we've all agreed shouldn't be able to get a gun. This is just common sense. And by the way, he and I built into this legislation a number of provisions to allow law-abiding gun owners to more fully exercise their Second Amendment rights. So, Mr. President, I hope that my colleagues will join me in working to advance this common sense bipartisan measure to keep our communities a little bit safer. I've never suggested that this would end mass shootings in America. That would be absurd. But it might make it a little more difficult for someone who doesn't belong owning a firearm to obtain one. Mr. President, I know in our country many people feel a deep sense of division. We saw it after the shooting at the Tree of Life. We see it sometime in the debates here, including over gun safety. But this isn't the first time or even the worst time we've been divided. Interestingly, the Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue was founded in 1864. It was during the Civil War. And when I was in Pittsburgh following the tragedy the day after the attack, I attended a beautiful memorial service just a few miles from the Tree of Life Synagogue. The service was at the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall. And at that ceremony, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Jews, and everyone, people from every walk of life were represented, people from throughout the greater Pittsburgh area, united to support their Jewish neighbors. It was fitting to gather at the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial. This memorial was founded by veterans of the Civil War in Allegheny County to honor the sacrifice and valor of those who were willing to die to save our country during that war. And the very first soldier from Allegheny County to die in the Civil War, was a married salesman in his early 30s from Pittsburgh. He died at the Battle of Williamsburg on May 5th, 1862. His name was Jacob Brunn. He was Jewish. But that didn't matter to Pittsburgh. The entire city turned out for his funeral. The entire city. As one historian put it, the city put religious and political differences aside to honor the man who was first to fall. Mr. President, I hope the Senate can also put aside some of our political differences and do something sensible. It's our duty, and it would be a fitting act of remembrance for victims of mass shootings at the Tree of Life, Thousand Oaks, Sandy Hook, and all the others whose deaths from gun violence have scarred our country. I yield the floor.